Chapter 14. Outcome. Duke Fernando de Braganza was sitting in his cabin and thinking about his plan of attack on the residence of the king, the castle of St. George. Nothing could escape his attention or occur unexpectedly. Now was the only opportunity for the Duke to enact his scheme. He was a knight, a soldier, a general, and knew of military affairs. Of course, he was aware that the African savages, de Braganza continued to believe the strangers were African, would be unable to besiege the castle of St. George. However, the Lord himself had brought his help to the Duke, sending the garrison of the castle away and granting him this opportunity. Right now, there were no more than 100 people inside the castle, only the guards, servants, and a few other military servants of the king. If he attacked them and could get inside, they would not be able to offer serious resistance, but if they managed to close the castle gate, the savages with their bows and spears instead of bombards, siege engines, and ladders would not be able to take the castle. The gate would have to be opened somehow, and then the savages would be able to crush the defenders of the castle with their numbers. And then, once the king fulfilled the conditions that the rebellious duke would present to him, the savages would receive the arsenal of the castle. It wouldn't do them much good. They wouldn't know how to use the crossbows, muskets, or cannons anyway. The duke looked complacently at the prepared scroll, the commitment that the king would sign. The scroll was tied with a white ribbon woven with depictions of bizarre people with animal heads. The Duke had secretly picked the ribbon up at Coatl's house on the ship. So, thought the Duke, first it would be necessary to bring the ship as close as possible to Lisbon in order for the savages to land. It would not work if it was too near the city, because even at night, it would be impossible not to notice such a large ship and an army. Seeing the savages, local people would take them for the Moors and hurry off to the royal castle to report it. Then, the castle would have time to prepare for the attack. He would need to land far from the city and go running toward the castle. If Africans appeared in Lisbon by day and made their way to the castle through the city, the citizens, seeing gold jewelry on the savages, would start to trade and barter. News about such profitable exchange would spread quickly to the merchants and money changers. Soon, the crowds would flood the streets and alleys and block the narrow streets of the city, and the Africans would be slowed too much. So, it would be best to move at night along the widest roads and streets, advancing to the castle on the hill quickly. Here began the most difficult part of the plan. Perhaps the guards would not notice the savages running to the hill among the city houses, but as the Africans began to climb the hill to the castle, the guards at the gates and, moreover, on the walls would be able to spot them at a glance. The guards would not only close the gates, but they would also be fortified with stones, which were always kept at the ready. The sentries would sound the alarm and start shooting, and the whole plan would be ruined. This could not be allowed. The Duke raised his head and looked at the bulkhead of his cabin. He suddenly remembered the fire in the house of Don Leandro, from which they barely escaped. The fire was so terrible that all who could ran and carried buckets of water and pikes to try to extinguish the blaze. Taking advantage of the commotion, the Duke, along with Nuno and Anaquona, managed to escape unnoticed. Through the windows of the cabin at the stern of the caravel, the Duke could see the outline of the giant ship as it followed. On the wall above the windows was the de Braganza family coat of arms, and the Duke decided, let it be what it will be. There was no turning back for him. He had nothing to lose. There would be no name, no title, no life itself if he were to escape now and leave. The Duke suddenly stood up from his chair. What if, he thought, the lips of the Duke pulling up into a devious smile. He had devised a plan to get into the castle without siege.
Great news!
The king exclaimed. He put a half-eaten chicken leg on a platter, grabbed a napkin, crumpled it, and threw it on the table.
Daniel! You managed to get rid of de Braganza and accomplish something that was beyond the power of a whole army. You have shamed General Afonso. That's right. Yes!
At the exclamation, a piece of partially chewed chicken flew out of the king's mouth. The chicken hit Daniel in the face. He took a step back but bumped into Estela's fist as she stood a little behind him. Daniel swayed, but immediately pulled himself together.
Glad to be of service, Your Majesty.
He answered loudly.
Ah, what wonderful soldiers are at my service! But what have you got going on there in Leiria? I have heard nothing but chatter about the city all day,
continued the king. He suddenly remembered how, before his eyes and under his command, Daniel's squad had stormed the walls of Estela and was the first to break into the city and open the gates for Duke de Braganza's cavalry detachment. The king turned his mind away from de Braganza. He no longer wanted to mark the beginning of that glorious defeat of the Moors with the Duke.
Well, you will be rewarded for this feat.
Yes, your majesty,
said Daniel. Stella sighed. For such a situation, the soldier father could have found better words.
Daniel,
continued the king, going up to the guests.
The sun is on the wane, and the road to Leiria is long. I offer you hospitality. My secretary will show you to the chambers reserved for my best guests. Lodge there for the night, my good sir and lady.
With the king's first glance at Estela, he decided she would soon share his bed. He would indulge her, and she would be obliged. He said,
I have also considered your daughter's request. She will be a worthy owner of Senta. Yes, yes. You deserve this estate, dear Estela. I have no doubt about that. In the morning, the secretary will give you my decree on this matter. I recognize you as the widow of the unfortunate Nuno, the sole heir of his parents, who also tragically passed away.
Daniel blushed. When they first entered the study, the king looked first at Estela, and then at him, and he had given his daughter such a look. If anyone else had ever dared to look at his daughter like that, Daniel would have smashed his nose without delay. Daniel glanced at Estela. Damn it! It was up to her now. It was no longer up to her father. Estela was also making incredible efforts to hold herself together, with great difficulty. Her mind was starting to get muddled, and her soul and body wanted to sing, shout, and dance. Everything had turned out exactly as she had planned. However, now she had to appear to show both gratitude to the king for his generosity and hospitality, and grief for the young groom who had tragically gone to heaven. In her mind, she was already imagining huge halls, noble and rich guests, and luxurious feasts, a life in which no one counted money or days. The king was already openly taking in Estela with his eyes. Tomorrow he would honorably send out the old father to Leiria. However, the daughter would be delayed for another day or two due to sluggishness or the sudden illness of the secretary. This beauty and Joao II would have a nice few days together. Then they would part forever. The king was sure of that. He knew that he was not capable of falling in love with a woman for more than 2 or 3 days. After that, he had to let them all go, with a generous reward of course, and there was never a case where the parents of these girls failed to greet them with joyful hugs. After dismissing the guests, the king sat down in a chair in front of the window, put his hands behind his head, and thought. He was happy today. Yes, happy. His sworn enemy, de Braganza, was destroyed. Surprisingly, the unexpected sometimes does exactly what you have been planning for weeks, months, or years. That's how chance brought such good news and this beautiful girl to his castle. He would do a good deed for this family by rewarding both Estela and her father. Joao II, who did not tolerate wine well, decided to celebrate this day anyway. He poured himself a full goblet and drank it down in one gulp. Immediately he seemed to be lifted up by angels. They carried him to the bedchamber and laid him on the bed. The king had not yet had time to inquire about Estela when he found himself in the arms of a deep sleep. The valet pulled off his majesty's boots and covered the king with a blanket. He knew the king would sleep until morning, and the king's sleep would be so deep that even a cannon shot would not be able to wake him. Camaxtli, Cihuacoatl of Tlaluacatli, was tired. No. Exhausted under the weight of the secret that he had to keep, and he decided to share it with Ocotlan. Camaxtli knew that only Ocotlan would be able to take his secret seriously, or Camaxtli didn't want to think about the worst, but he didn't want to keep this secret to himself either. He couldn't take it anymore. It was too much to bear. At the hour when the Ichkahuipilli was being offered to Tezcatlipoca, as Cotl stood at the top of the pyramid and the crowd danced at its foot, the Cihuacoatl, Camaxtli, and the tlacochcalcatl Ocotlan were standing in the Audiobook room just under the hanging circle and among scattered rubber balls. The warriors were waiting for Ocotlan below deck to go to the shore, and Camaxtli begged the commander to give him a moment of attention, and told him,
"Only now, with Cotl and the rest of the people gone for the festival, was I able to get into the tlatoani's house and take this."
Camaxtli showed Ocotlan a scroll.
"Before you read it, I have to tell you something. When Moctezuma conquered the Totonac tribes, I, one of the most capable students in Teotihuacan, was sent to build this city, Tlaluacatli. Together with me, the best masters of Itza built this city, those experienced in the construction of large boats and the best stargazers. I helped build all this."
And Camaxtli made a circle around himself with his hands.
"Together with them."
Ocotlan looked into the eyes of Camaxtli and was silent. They could hear the shouts of the crowd and the music that accompanied the dance of death.
"My father,"
Camaxtli continued,
"loved the starry sky and knew it well. He knew how to draw it so that, having these paths on a mattle at hand, the warriors of the sea could always find the right way in any direction. One day he went to Tenochtitlan, to the weyitlatoani Axayacatl. He showed him the paths with directions, which he had made especially for the Tlaluacatli voyage. Axayacatl stargazers said that they were the best paths inscribed on a mattle that they had ever seen. Axayacatl decided that my father and I were the best suited to manage Tlaluacatli on the big water because my father held the best knowledge of where to go, and I knew everything about how Tlaluacatli was built."
Of course.
Ocotlan agreed.
After all, you know better if you built it yourself.
"My father,"
Camaxtli continued,
"could have found the right way on the water even without the paths he had drawn on the amatl, even without the sun, which could go behind the clouds for a long time. The man from the Itza tribes, who also knows how to navigate, helped me learn about it in Tlaluacatli. Axayacatl promised my father that he would make him tlatoani of Tlaluacatli and announce it at a special festive meeting in his palace. At the same time, Axayacatl was going to entrust me with the navigation of Tlaluacatli along the paths that my father had drawn. He told my father, his friend, that he had prepared this and all other appointments for new positions in advance, but when they were distributed, he wanted to check the honesty of some people. I don't know how he was going to check it, but during the ceremony, the curse of Tepialatl happened."
Are you talking about that terrible earthquake?
Ocotlan asked.
"Yes, and during that disaster my father died, and now look."
Camaxtli stretched out the scroll he was clutching to Ocotlan. Ocotlan opened it and saw on it the signs denoting the position of tlatoani of Tlaluacatli. The scroll was covered with brown spots of dried blood.
"This is the scroll that the great tlatoani Axayacatl handed my father,"
said Camaxtli.
"and now Cotl hides it."
Total?
"Yes. Blood stains may keep the secret of my father's death, and they may keep the secret of how Cotl became tlatoani of Tlaluacatli, but yet he does not know how to calculate the path of the stars and other heavenly bodies. He is only able to find his way by the sun, and even then with difficulty."
Ocotlan looked at the scroll again, rolled it up, and turned to Camaxtli.
Put it back where you found it,
He said.
and don't tell anyone what you have told me.
With these words, Ocotlan left the room. Somewhere above, there was a thud of a body flying down the steps of the pyramid. Finally, it hit the water. The crowd roared with delight. Camaxtli did not understand Ocotlan's behavior, but his heart felt much lighter. A deafening explosion shook the buildings near the port of Lisbon, and then a huge flame erupted on the water. It was a fire on the caravel of Duke de Braganza. The flames were so large that, as it turned out later, a girl blind from birth, in a house that stood on the hill nearly 2 leagues from the port, could see it. In the meantime, the fire that engulfed the ship blinded the residents of nearby houses and illuminated the clouds in the midnight sky. Birds rushed over the river with shouts. Everywhere in the city, there were cries of awakened infants, and old women crossed themselves. The port was as bright as on a clear afternoon. Those townspeople that had boats and small ships in the port rushed out to check on their crafts, while many other onlookers clamored out of their homes just to watch the fire. There were stampedes on the streets.
"Look at that,"
said one of the archers on the south tower to his partner, who was walking along the western wall of the castle.
"Someone just went broke. That's not lucky for that poor guy."
The partner walked nervously along the wall towards the fire. The guard of the south gate shouted from below.
"Hey there. What's burning? What blew up?"
The archer leaned over the edge of the tower and shouted back.
"Tavino, Roger, just look at how beautiful it is."
The guards exchanged glances. It was forbidden to leave their posts on pain of death. However, the sight, judging by the glare that illuminated the clouds and the sky, was such that it would have been like death to miss it. One of them spat with annoyance, opened the door in the gate, and, immediately turning onto the spiral staircase, began to climb the south tower. His partner looked around. There wasn't a soul to be seen. Then he, too, darted through the door, slammed it shut, barely managing to pull his pike up to him, and also began to climb up. Meanwhile, the archers who walked on the other walls of the castle also began to come up to the south wall. The sight of the fire was truly stunning. It seemed as if a giant flower was opening its petals in the middle of the sea. The flames were rising so high that the ship itself could hardly be seen. The guards at the north gate were also restless.
"Sean!"
One of the guards shouted to the other.
"Look!"
"I'm looking. Well, it is just fire. Big deal."
"Look there."
The partner pointed to the tops of the towers illuminated by the fire.
All the men ran to the south wall. "Yeah, they'll get a good look at everything there, and
They'll be hanged."
I told you, everyone ran. They won't hang everyone. Let's go after them."
Abandoning their post, the guards of the north gate also climbed the wall and ran after the others. Glancing at the courtyard inside the castle, they saw servants and maids, cooks and grooms, coachmen and coopers, in short, all the inhabitants of the castle, running to the south wall. Suddenly, one of the guards of the north gate named Evangelisto stopped. Sean was already lost from his sight, merged with the crowd on the south wall. Who the hell stayed at their posts then? Evangelisto had very recently been flogged for drunkenness. The punishment was still fresh in his memory and vividly echoed on his butt. What was he thinking? Would he have to taste punishment again? Evangelisto frowned, took his pike more comfortably, and went back. Other guards were running towards him. The flames of the fire were reflected in their wide-open eyes. Some were so crazy that they pushed Evangelisto, who was interfering with their passage. When he reached his post at the gate of the north tower, Evangelisto opened the door in the gate and looked out. The fire illuminated the city, the surrounding area, and the slopes of the hill on which the castle stood. But at the gate of the north tower, sheltered from the fire by the hill, the castle, and the tower itself, the glow was not visible. Wherever Evangelisto's eyes turned, there was darkness and not a soul anywhere. Evangelisto crossed the bridge over the moat. Despite the noise of the fire and the screams that merged into a general hum, he did not hear anything suspicious. Evangelisto's hearing was good. He was able to guess by the sound how many horsemen were approaching the castle and in which direction they were going. By the creak of armor and the clang of weapons, he could also determine the number of troops that were making themselves known. In addition, if unknown people approached the gate, they would first be seen from afar by the guards on the tower, then met by the guards at the gate. Whoever approached the castle knew perfectly well that dozens of eyes were watching at that moment. The guards knew that too. None of them felt lonely, even when the pitch-black darkness descended on the city. No one was afraid, because everyone was holding the best weapons in their hands. Pikes, swords, halberds, and crossbows. Evangelisto walked to the northern slope of the hill and looked down. The flames of the fire flared up fiercely. Probably something exploded in the hold, and in the light of this flash, he saw something incredible. and he experienced a horror he had never experienced before. Up the hill, through the streets and roads leading to the castle, an army was rushing at Evangelisto. The warriors did not run, but jumped forward, covering a distance of several fathoms with each jump. These people were half naked. All their clothes and hats were made up of animal skins, and their helmets had feathers sticking out in different directions. They were already running up to the path that ran under the castle, encircling the entire hill. At the same time, they moved completely noiselessly. The whole army was rushing forward and at the same time did not make a sound. Evangelisto clumsily turned back to the bridge. He was rushing to the gate. The door in the gate had to be closed in time by all means. However, his armor and pike prevented it from being done quickly enough. Evangelisto was hit on the back with a monstrous force and, before he could reach the bridge, he was shoved into the moat. The eagle and jaguar warriors, who had received clear orders from Ocotlan and Tupac, who, in turn, had been instructed by the Duke, knew about this door in the gate. Evangelisto, coming out of this door, did not close it, and now the warriors rushed straight to it. Some moments passed, and then the north gate of the castle of St. George, the strongest of all strongholds in Portugal, the abode of the king, his nobles and officials, were thrown open. The foreign army rushed inside with the speed of a mountain stream. None of them really knew what would be waiting for them there. Some of these eagles and jaguars were timid. They had never seen such huge stone houses in their lives, now illuminated by the flames of the massive fire in the distance. Then the silence that this army had been protecting for so long was suddenly broken by a heart-rending scream. A sleepy laundress, who did not yet know about the fire, but went out to the yard for another need, screamed at the sight of the eagles and jaguars. The strangers rushed to the unfortunate woman. With one wave of a club with obsidian blades, she fell to the ground dead. But her cry had been heard. The laundress's husband, an old sergeant of the Royal Guard meant to retire the next week, spewing curses, was hurrying after the distraught guards to disperse the sentries to their posts, but heard the scream and rushed back. At the sight of the foreigners, he immediately rushed to the south wall.
Alarm! Alarm! You rascals!
He shouted. The sergeant didn't have time to run far. He didn't survive his wife by a minute, but the sergeant's alarm had been heard.
Men, alarm!
A young soldier shouted as he ran along the edge of the southern wall towards a cluster of sentries who had thoughtlessly abandoned their posts.
We've been attacked! To arms!
Meanwhile, the warriors ruthlessly dealt with other inhabitants of the castle. They found them in the courtyard, in servants' dwellings, workshops, guard rooms, and other houses. The warriors, sometimes in threes or sometimes even in tens, rushed at everyone and did not give anyone a single chance to survive. Soon, arrows began to fly from the walls at the eagles and jaguars. The guards who had come to their senses ran out into the courtyard and engaged in battle there. There were few of them, but they knew the castle well, and now the strangers were falling under the swings of their swords. Here and there they began to retreat. Finally, the commander of a small detachment left behind by the departed garrison ran out of the barracks. Without looking, he fired a crossbow into the darkness in front of him, dropped that and drew his sword.
Attack!
He shouted to the sleepy soldiers in the barracks who were already grabbing weapons. A terrible life and death battle ensued in the courtyard. Arrows fired by the newcomers' bows hit the Portuguese armor now and then without harming them. However, the warriors, using their special shoes, were able to jump up and forward, each time successfully hitting soldiers who were petrified at the sight of such a miracle. These strangers were learning literally on the fly. They no longer fired at the armor, nor did they hit the soldiers with their terrible clubs. No, they aimed at necks and faces, and their blows were crushing. Portuguese soldiers fell one by one on the cobblestones that paved the courtyard. Blood was already flowing down it in streams. Ocotl, Ocotlan, Duke de Braganza, Nuno, and Anaquona were among those who broke into the castle through the north gate and were the last to enter.
Close the gate immediately.
The Duke shouted.
Nuno, what are you standing still for? Help.
Without waiting for an answer from the dumbfounded Nuno, the Duke himself grabbed the gate. The other door was immediately closed by some vigilant jaguar. With the help of Nuno, the Duke showed Tupac, who arrived just in time, how the gate could be locked. Then he ordered the gates to be filled up from the inside with the stones, boulders, and logs that were stored right at hand. By order of the Duke, Tupac sent detachments of his warriors to another gate, ordering them to do the same with that one. Soon, the bodies of almost all the last defenders of the castle lay in the courtyard. Guards armed with bows still continued to shoot at the strangers from the walls, but there were already only a few of them left. Some of the sentries who had gone down to the courtyard got involved in the battle and died there. 5 jaguars, who noticed where the sentries were coming from, opened the door of the tower and rushed up to the walls. Soon the last defenders of the castle were falling from the walls lifeless. The warriors, gradually lowering their weapons, began to look around. Some averted their eyes from the castle tower and walls, and then looked at them again, unable to believe what they were seeing. They had seen pyramids in their homeland, but still the gigantic structures here, which served as a haven for the tlatoani of the local weyitlatoani, were greatly superior to their pyramids. Ocotl, too, was beginning to realize that even the hundreds of hand-picked eagles and jaguars he had brought here would be too small an army to hold this huge city or even the palace itself. So, it was necessary to quickly do what they came here for and return to Tlaluacatli. Soon the other squad would come here, the one the weyitlatoani and Black Ichkahuipilli had spoken about before, and there would be many more warriors in this detachment than the already defeated defenders of this city. At that time, Ocotl did not yet know how true his guesses were. Indeed, a garrison under the command of General Afonso was already nearing the city. The huge detachment of the general was tired from the trek from Evora to Lisbon, and his soldiers were continuing on with the last of their strength, but there were hundreds of them, so they could still take on an enemy at a moment's notice. However, none of them, including Afonso, knew that the castle had been captured. Today, Duke Fernando de Braganza had been incredibly lucky. The guards guarding the entrance to the tower of the royal residence, hearing the heart-rending screams of those fighting with the warriors, had rushed to the aid of their brothers in arms, and now the way to the king's chambers was open. All that was necessary was to climb to the top of the tower where the king was, and now the Duke was making exactly this ascent. The Duke knew St. George's Castle very well. He had visited many times, had gone through all the corridors and stairs in his time, spent days there at meetings with kings and his nobles and nights at feasts. Following the Duke, at the head of a detachment of eagles and jaguars, Ocotl and Ocotlan burst into the open doors of the royal residence. Nuno was running after them, holding Anaquona's hand. They raced up, almost overtaking the Duke. They were all in a hurry because they realized that they themselves were now in danger and therefore must return to Tlaluacatli as soon as possible. On the stairs of one of the intermediate floors, the way was blocked by 2 guards who had remained faithful to their duty and stayed to protect the king in the upper reaches of the tower. With their pikes in front of them, they rushed at the strangers, but the warriors, as they had done more than once that night, used a completely unexpected technique. They jumped up to the high ceilings and fell on them from above. Their attack brought success. The lifeless bodies of the guards remained lying on the floor, and the Duke and his companions continued their way, first along the corridor, and then up the stairs. The Duke was no longer young, and the armor, which he had not taken off, created additional difficulty for him. Yet now he felt neither the weight of years nor the weight of the armor. He ran and ran forward, panting with joyful certainty. Now his dream would come true. The king would be brought to submission of the Cortes or be destroyed. Once he reached the bedchamber door, the Duke did not stop. Knowing that this door opened inward, he threw his whole body at it. The door swung open. After running in a few more steps, the Duke found himself in the center of the luxurious royal chambers. Cihuacoatl and Ocotlan followed the Duke, as well as Nuno and Anaquona. The room was dark and quiet. The spacious bedroom was only illuminated by the flashes of the distant fire. Nuno returned to the entrance of the bedroom and brought in a torch that burned steadily. Daniel woke up to a clamor, which he immediately recognized as the sounds of a fierce battle. Strange exclamations, which even Moors did not make, accompanied the noise, and it certainly wasn't Portuguese soldiers who were shouting. Daniel knew their battle cries well. Daniel jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. A fire was burning somewhere far away. Below, in the courtyard of the castle, the battle was raging. The guards of the castle were fighting off a lot of people whom Daniel recognized with horror, the tribesmen of the very prisoner who had recently been captured by his soldiers on the shore of the Big Turtle. Estela ran out of the next room. Like Daniel, she was wearing a nightgown.
Father, what's going on there?
As if in response to Estela, the trampling of sabotants and the cursing of guards running down the corridor were heard outside the door. The sound continued down the stairs toward the first floor.
What's going on?
Estela raised her voice.
I don't know yet.
Daniel exclaimed.
But either this guard doesn't know how to fight, or their commanders have already been killed.
Who are they fighting with?
I don't know.
Daniel shouted louder.
I don't understand what is happening. Even if the castle were attacked by Moors or rebels, their army could not have approached unnoticed. Even as they arrived, they would have begun a siege of the castle first, but there has been no siege, that's clear, and there's a big fire somewhere. It seems to be in the direction of the river.
Someone ran past Daniel's door in the opposite direction. Judging by the creaking and rattling, there were several people, one in armor and others wearing a lot of small jewelry. Daniel hugged his daughter and sat down with her. The noise receded towards the stairs, which began at the end of the corridor and led up. Daniel opened the door a crack and looked out into the corridor.
Father, don't go there.
Estela, usually obstinate and self-willed, pleaded.
If the castle was attacked, then...
The guardroom the guards had abandoned was not far away. Daniel rushed there and saw open cabinets with weapons. Daniel grabbed 2 muskets and a sword and returned to Estela. At that moment, there was a crash from above. Daniel would have been glad not to trust his instincts, but he already knew the reason for the noise. Someone had broken into the king's bedroom. Judging by the way Estela screamed, she understood it too. Was the king in danger? Daniel walked over to the lamp flickering on a table in the corner of the room and examined the muskets. They were loaded.
Estela,
he said sternly.
Pick up a musket. You may have to fire it.
Estela resolutely took the musket in her hands.
Raise the muzzle to the ceiling.
Daniel said, and Estela raised her musket.
Look.
Daniel pulled back the trigger.
Your musket is armed. All you have to do is point the musket at the enemy and pull here.
Daniel put his finger on the trigger.
But God forbid you to pull on it earlier. Do you hear?
Yes, Father.
Take your finger away. Like that. Put it in this place only when you have to shoot. Now let's go.
Daniel cautiously looked out of the room into the corridor. There was no one there. Meanwhile, incomprehensible noises were coming from the king's bedroom. Estela suddenly remembered how recently she and Nuno were riding to the Big Turtle Hill on the coast, and Nuno was telling her that his father wanted him to learn how to shoot. Then, Estela had secretly laughed at him. How could she have imagined that she herself would need this skill so soon? Daniel stood where he was, listening to the noises in the royal bedroom and in the courtyard. He thought painfully, what should they do? Their rooms were in the middle of a corridor between 2 staircases. If they went out into the corridor, they would not be able to hide, since the corridor was long and narrow. Even if they managed to hit the enemy with the muskets, it still would not mean salvation. Other intruders could have followed. But who the hell were they? Daniel returned to the room, went to the window, and looked out into the courtyard. Too high. To jump out of here would result in crashing on the cobblestones, or at least breaking legs. It would not be possible to escape in this way anyway. Daniel remembered the creaking of the gate, which he heard as soon as he woke up. The gates were closed. There was no way out of the castle. Had the castle been captured by the very rebels mentioned in the king's message? In the very message that sent Daniel to Leandro's house to capture Duke de Braganza? So, could these men be the Duke's accomplices? If so, then he and Estela, the captain who killed the Duke at the Cinta estate and his daughter, would not be left alive by the rebels. What else could they do? For Estela's sake, Daniel should hide in the rooms reserved for him and his daughter, sit there quietly and pray, but duty commanded Daniel to go to the king's defense. Daniel was reminded of this again by the sounds coming from above. He must come to the defense of Joao II. The whole city should know about the battle in the castle by now. Help must be hurrying to the castle.